Hello, good afternoon. Happy Thursday. Is everybody excited to be here on the last day of Summit at the very end of the day? I'm so excited. I really thought it was just going to be me and the camera, so I'm super happy that I can talk to real people. I'm going to present a few slides, and then we will definitely have time for Q&A, and then I'll be around for afterwards. So I don't want you guys to think like this will just be a one-way conversation, because that would be really boring for you on a Thursday afternoon right after lunch. I'm Robin Sutara. I am a field CDO with Databricks. I think I have the best job at the entire company, and that I get to work with some amazing customers and clients to help them figure out how to actually execute against their data strategy, leveraging Databricks as a technology. My career before joining Databricks, I wasn't born at Databricks. I actually did only start here a couple of years ago. Prior to that, I spent 23 years at Microsoft. I promise I started when I was like 12. I'm not that old. I don't feel that old. But I started supporting IE5 on Windows 3.1 and worked my way up to Chief Data Officer of Microsoft UK. I know the British accent probably threw you off, but I do actually live in the US in Redmond. So what I would love to share with you is a little bit about the impact that we were seeing across our customers with this introduction of generative AI in the last year, and what we're seeing organizations respond in their data and AI strategy with. And so hopefully it'll plant a few seeds on your data strategy, what you're looking to execute, and see if you have the same sort of questions and concerns and how you're addressing it. So really the foundation of every data strategy is to think about it from a people, process, and platform perspective. I know we're technologists and we love to focus just on the platform and just on the tech, and Databricks is cool, and look at this new Lakeview feature, and all these things we're going to be able to solve with the new version of Unity Catalog, and it's open source, and oh my gosh, it's great. But how do we think about the people and process that go behind that? Now, the interesting problem was about a year ago, this little thing called generative AI came out, and it was really, really fascinating to attend all of these sessions. There were sort of two camps that you would see. There were some people who were saying generative AI represents the destruction of all mankind, right? And we were definitely going to have a Skynet, Terminator. I'm surprised we're all still in the room. It was just going to be horrible. And then you had another camp that was sort of saying, oh my gosh, total enlightenment. People will stop having to work. We can do all of these amazing things as a result of generative AI. I think now, a year later, we see neither one of those is true. But what we are seeing is that it's introducing a new level of complexity to how we think about our data strategies, particularly the governance and how you sort of manage the controls around that. So I think, when we first started in the governance space on your data platform, it was really all about what data was there, who had access to the data, how were they using the data. And then we sort of saw this evolution of master data management and data quality, data ownership, data steward come into the data governance sort of foundation and considerations. Then we had GDPR, and you start to think about things like data residency and data sovereignty. Then you have traditional AI, which introduced ethics. Now we're seeing data strategies really have to think about governance being foundational in this strategy, because there's all this change that's happening in the space, because regulation and legislation for generative AI has not been set, right? We see the passage of the EU AI Act, which gives us some characteristics and some foundations of that. We saw the US executive order was very similar. US legislation has not passed any sort of law yet. And so what we're seeing is states are responding now with state level legislation. So most strategies are taking this perspective of, yes, I have this people, process, and platform that I have to think about, but now I have this whole other level of complexity, and that my governance foundations are now becoming more complex and more spread out. So what we're going to talk about is the major strategic themes when you're creating your data strategy, particularly as your executives are trying to set the strategy or make sure that you have your strategy set up to enforce what they're trying to tackle. And there's 4 components to a successful strategy, in my experience. The first is making sure that you have the foundation set, which we'll walk through. Then how do you start to think about the people and the organizational structure around that? What's the impact that your strategy is going to have on your processes, or the change that needs to happen to your processes? And then what are some of the practical platform considerations to take into account? So let's start with the foundations of a transformation. The very first thing that for most organizations is that when a new technology like generative AI comes out, everybody just wants to play with the cool new feature or the cool new technology. Getting your organization to think about what is the vision or mission for our organization. I was really fortunate to work for a company like Microsoft for so long. I mean, when I first started in the 90s, our mission was a PC on every desktop. I think people would laugh at that now. I don't even think my kids understand that most desktops didn't have a PC ever. Right, but then they evolved their mission to be empower every organization on the planet to achieve more. And a lot of that transformation of the vision was a transformation of the company. So as organizations start to think about the impact that generative AI is going to have on them as a transformation, how is it going to change what you deliver, who you deliver to, what are the services that you're going to provide, what problem are you trying to solve? For some, it's changing their mission, it's changing their vision. And so make sure that your strategy as you're building it out, that you still have clarity on the vision of what the organization is going to be. Is generative AI going to change that? Is your board and your CEO rethinking what the organization is going to be when they grow up and when they get to the end of the transformation? Once you understand what that mission is and what that vision is, clarify what the principles are. What are the guiding principles going to be for the decisions that you make? These will help you define the standards across the organization. For example, if you say, based on our mission, we are going to have the principle that we are going to aim toward a single copy of the data. I mean, everybody can laugh now because nobody will ever get to a single copy of the data, but you essentially say, in principle, we would like to minimize the amount of copies of data that we have. So our aspiration is a single copy of the data. Right? And so then every decision that you make as you execute against the strategy can be aligned with that principle. So what that helps is it helps you get the commitment from the organization and the leadership across the organization, because as you've defined the principles, everybody understands why decisions are being made in a certain way. And what that helps you do is actually then create clarity for the organization around the decisioning as you execute against the strategy. Once you have your vision and then you know what principles that you've set in place, now is where you start to get a little more specific on the measurable metrics that you're going to put in place. And this part always really just sort of makes me laugh in that there is no shortage of metrics in the data space. How many in here have KPIs that they follow within their organization? They track it. Oh, everybody should have a hand up. None of you work toward metrics? Oh my gosh, I'm going to work at your company, really. So when I worked at Microsoft, I definitely would walk into organizations where I would say, okay, what are the KPIs for the organization? What are we looking to drive with the data platform? And how are we going to measure success? Well, here's the 50 KPIs that we have around data quality. Here's the 75 KPIs that we have around ingestion. Here's the 300 KPIs that we have for the business. It just becomes excessive and a lot. And so what happens is the organization really struggles to know which KPIs matter. How are you going to prioritize those metrics so that you know what you're working toward? It's not to say that you won't have that many KPIs, but my recommendation is as you're executing against your strategy, pick 5. Pick your top 5 KPIs that are going to drive behavior, that are going to drive change, that are going to sort of make people change the way that they do the business. Because if they're trying to track too many metrics, they're not going to pay attention to any of them. So when you think about a data quality metric, think about the one that's actually going to encourage people to enter quality data into the system. And that's the thing that you're going to measure and hold people accountable for. So once you understand the vision and you understand the guiding principles of how you're going to make the decisions, the next thing to do is sort of assess where you are. And for many organizations, this means some level of maturity assessment. Are you being reactive? Are you stable? Are you being preventative? We all know that we want to be at 5, and I can guarantee you most people will measure themselves as 5 when you give them a self-assessment, or 4, right? I have a slight room for improvement. My recommendation is to not only do a self-assessment, but do a third-party assessment, whether that's if you're doing it for a specific business group, get another stakeholder or business group to do the assessment on them. You can bring in an SI. Databricks has a maturity assessment that we'd be happy to share with you as a framework. There's lots of ways that you can go about this, but you need to take an honest look at where is the organization today? Where are the things that we need to focus as we think about execution of our strategy? And does our strategy allow us to actually execute against that? The other place that I see many organizations fail when they're executing against their strategy is around change management. And while I shared the ProSci methodology, please don't get angry with me. I know people are religious about their change management methodologies, but essentially pick a methodology and really have somebody own the change and the transformation that you're trying to roll out with your data and AI strategy. The interesting part with the introduction of generative AI is lots of organizations start to look around and realize they didn't have anybody that really owned the generative AI or the AI strategy. Or they had everybody in the organization saying that they owned the AI strategy. And so what that ended up happening is that people were doing change and transformation in pockets, but there was nobody actually managing the change from an organizational level. So get the stakeholders together across the C-suite and make sure that you have clarity on who actually owns the change and who's going to be responsible, so that you have clarity on the roles and responsibilities as you're going through that transformation. And I would actually say GenAI didn't create this problem, but it exacerbated it. It definitely made it more visible across organizations as they tried to actually pilot and roll these things out. I think many organizations quickly started to realize that they didn't have formalization around the change management process in their organization. And the other fundamental, I will say, particularly when it came to generative AI, that a lot of organizations found themselves in, was that they didn't have diverse representation across their data science, their data analytics teams. And the problem is that data inherently, or historically, tends to be biased. And so if your data teams are not diverse, you're just going to propagate through AI those biases, right? Because your machine learning is just going to propagate the same biases that exist in the data. And if your data science team isn't diverse to recognize those biases, then your organization is in a particular issue. The problem is, if you look at the EU AI Act or some of the pending legislation that we know is coming, a lot of it has to do about explainability, transparency, making sure that you don't have egregious bias causing issues to your customers or citizens. And so this is going to become even more critical and important, because there'll be personal liability on the part of leaders that allow egregious activity to happen to someone as a result of the AI and machine learning that you're running in your organization. So it's going to become even more critical that we think about, how do you introduce not just gender bias, but cultural bias, education bias. I always sort of used to tease at Microsoft that I worked in the University of Wisconsin club, right? Because they all graduated from the same database school. They all had the same background, the same education. And so how do you innovate and how do you recognize when you're sort of doing that group thinking if you don't have others? I actually started my technical career repairing Apache helicopters. So I love to say that I came full circle, Apache to Apache Spark, right? So I am now, right? I bring a diverse perspective. I didn't grow up traditional STEM. I grew up with hands-on practicality. And so it just gives a different point of view as we try to roll out some of these ecosystems. So once you have those foundations in place, now you need to start to think about people. And I would actually say people are the number one reason why your organization will not be successful with generative AI, right? Because it's not that the technology isn't going to work for you. You all are going to do amazing things with the technology and getting it set up. The hard part will be getting the people across your organization to use the data products and services that you're creating as a result of generative AI. So there's a few things that organizations and CEOs typically ask me about here. The first is, how do we think about organizing our teams and organizing our structures? So we tend to have these data personas that are supporting each of these sort of teams or products or businesses. My first recommendation to them is usually think about your organization not by people. How many here have ever been through a reorg? Has anybody ever had oh, thank God, at least you raised your hand for that one. Yes, so if you align your organizations by people, you will always have to reshift your structure, right? You will never be able then to have consistency. You'll never be able to make progress. You'll constantly be in change of the reorganization as opposed to rolling out the capabilities and the transformation that you're looking to roll out. So many organizations think about, okay, once I align by function, how do I start to then think about how do I align my data resources? Data science and data engineers and data analysts are a scarce resource in today's economy. And with generative AI, there's more demand on those scarce resources. So how do you think about aligning them so that there's capability to build business insight and function and deliver value to the organization, at the same time giving the team the capability to grow and learn in a way to continue to attract and retain that talent that you have? So my recommendation is usually for data engineers operate really well in a centralized function, right? Because that way they can deliver that efficient, effective ingestion of data. in the central data platform to deliver for all of the organization. You typically don't need to understand directly the difference in the data between the finance team or the HR team. Always. Sometimes you do, but for the most part, if you're going to ingest data, you're creating the pipelines in the same way, regardless of what the source of data is. For data analysts or business analysts, they tend to reside within the business, right? They really need to understand the business problems they're trying to solve, the business questions they're looking to solve. I know we all want data genie so that the business analyst can be self-sufficient, but at some point, at least for now, generative AI is definitely still not in place, so that we need those data analysts to be aligned by the business so that they understand that. Data science is a really interesting space in that we're finding most large-scale organizations or mature organizations actually have data scientists sitting both. They have some level of centralized data science function that are providing the horizontal solutions, providing the capabilities and creating the standards and the frameworks around how you're going to actually execute against ML ops, et cetera. And then you have some level of data science within the business that are solving specific functional problems along those paths. I know that causes a little bit of contention, but the nice part is that creates some level of a career opportunity. So if you're currently a data scientist and you're sitting in finance, the skills that you're learning in that organization, you can apply to another business function, or you could think about some of the horizontal problems that you can solve. Likewise, if you're a data analyst and you're sitting in one business, you can start to think about growth opportunities to either learn another part of the business to be able to drive business value and think about those things. The other thing is thinking about meeting users where they are. I always find it really funny. At Databricks, we deliver great, phenomenal training. I'm sure, who here had a chance to do the training on Monday and Tuesday? Great training, right? Phenomenal. What we don't always do is help you figure out how are you going to enable your business users to be able to use the platform in the most effective way. I seriously doubt I would ever get the Microsoft CFO to sit in a notebook and code in SQL. It's probably just not going to happen. And so we really have to start to think about, as you're building these generative AI solutions, assistants are great, co-pilots are great, Genie rooms are great, but how are we really going to make sure that as you're leveraging and rolling out your transformation and change across the organization, making sure that you're meeting all of the users where they are, and that means technical and non-technical users. Because AI is going to change how they interact with the data. Everyone at some point wants to be able to find and use data based on their own business terminology. They want the business semantics built in logically on top of the data. But your business teams actually want to query in natural language. They don't want to have to learn Python. They don't want to have to learn SQL. They want to be able to just ask. How many of you have a CEO that said, just let me talk to my data? I just want to chat with my data. Really? At least a few nods. I see a few nods. Right? So I sat in a lot of board conversations and every CEO was like, I just put a chatbot on it. I just want to talk to my data, and it just isn't quite that easy. So how do we bring them along on this transformation journey to say, this is how you do it? First time I used ChatGPT, I treated it like Google and it spit up and threw up all over me, right? We really have to train these people on how to use these systems and tools that you're leveraging with generative AI. I think the other thing to think about is, as you're thinking about upskilling that talent, you're recreating your data and AI culture. I've worked with some of the biggest organizations across the UK that have done some fabulous things here around data 101 days, AI academies, almost gamifying, bringing your business users and those that you interact and work with along on this journey with you. So as you're building out the technical capabilities of the platform, it allows you to actually build the business capabilities. For most leaders, I tell them, think about the learning paths that you'll need for those business users and the technical users, because it's going to require, as part of the change management, for them to understand why you're doing the transformation and executing this strategy, as well as create the desire for them to want to change as well. How many of you have ever set a New Year's resolution and then broke it within a month? It's because we're human, right? We don't like to change. I don't like to change. You don't like to change. So you really have to think about that. There were plenty of times that I would send out an email to Azure engineers, and I would think, okay, we're ready to do the change. And half of them would say, what email? You sent me an email. Why are we changing? What are we doing? Why? And so think about all of those paths. How do you build that culture? How do you communicate? How do you over-communicate? How do you give multiple learning capabilities to be able to do that? The other thing to think about is once you have people on board for the change, how do you actually think about the processes? And it's really always interesting to me because what we saw, particularly, does anybody remember the Samsung case? When ChatGPT first came out and those poor little Samsung employees entered in their trade secrets into ChatGPT and essentially then lost all intellectual property rights to their, yes? People remember? Yes? Okay. So it was really interesting because at the time I lived in London and there were multiple countries, including Italy, that just said, that's it, no ChatGPT in the country whatsoever. Nobody can use it, complete lockdown. And so it was interesting how many organizations really started to follow that path of, oh my gosh, our intellectual property rights could be at risk because we haven't trained anybody yet how to use this. And so lock it all down, just nobody can use anything. Then you had other organizations that sort of said, well, no, how do we think about setting up playgrounds? How do we set up test beds? How do we think about leveraging that? We had some who said, don't use it at work, you can use it at home. We had others who just sort of said, let us figure it out and we'll create a policy at some point. And so really think about as you're rolling out this generative AI strategy across your organization, what are the right controls for your organization? What are the processes that you do want that rigor, that you do want those controls to say, absolutely not, it's a stop sign, you cannot pass? And which ones do you want to be a roundabout where you want to innovate and you want to test and you want to be a little agile? For most organizations, this means that any of your proprietary information, any of your PII information are not the things that they're testing around generative AI and letting the organization be agile with it. The other thing is to think about the right enforcement, right, when those policies aren't followed. It was really interesting to me. I was sitting with a communication sector customer who was saying, how are we going to enforce these Gen AI policies? I can't even get people to follow the existing government affairs policies that we have in place. In fact, we deliver training and the very next day, I have a violation report of somebody not sort of following it. So we have to think about, because of the existing ecosystem, how do you make sure you have the right enforcement right in place that allows you to iterate against those policies? What can we enforce with technology? What's going to require education and enablement? And then how do we make sure that those are delivering against the controls that we want to put in place across the organization? We do see lots of organizations still in that test phase. Very few organizations have actually deployed generative AI at scale. There's lots and lots of POCs happening across the ecosystem. I think large language models sort of came out last year, and then there was just this huge hype and exponential increase in the number of large language models that we saw created. Who here remembers DBRX? #1 model for 2 weeks, yes? And then we got displaced, which is fine. It's exactly, right? We want to continue to innovate. We want organizations to continue to think about how do they leverage large language models in the right way, because we know there's going to be the next version of the model. We know there's going to be the next capability. So the problem with that is you have to make sure you're chasing the right use case, right? Because as it continues to evolve at the pace that it's evolving, you don't want to get caught up in a use case that you can't justify why you made that investment across the organization. So for many organizations, this is thinking about, what are those use cases that we can tackle that are going, because you've already established your vision and mission, right? You can start to say, these are the things that we're going to pursue as as sort of our use case for generative AI within the organization, because it's going to deliver that measurable metric business value that we define that's aligned with our vision. The other thing is you need to help the organization not just think of this as a net new toy, right, across the organization. You really tie it back to that business value. And then make sure that you're considering the other things you've heard earlier today, I'm sure, but make sure that you're still building it on quality data. And so many of the CEO conversations that I'm having are, do we have the right foundations in place for generative AI? Because while we just had data strategies a couple of years ago and people were still thinking about how do we modernize, how are we going to migrate to the cloud, et cetera, I think what this generative AI really did was make organizations push harder on making sure that they had the foundations in place, because you can't do AI without the data. And so a lot of the de-investment that we started to see in getting the modernization and migration to the cloud is now starting to increase as we see organizations want to have the capability to pursue generative AI use cases, but they have to have those foundations in place first. We do still see, I think, we've seen that while there was a hype at the very beginning, we sort of thought everything was going to be solved by prompt engineering. It was going to be really quick. That was going to solve all things world peace. I think today it's really around RAG. Lots of organizations are experimenting with RAG, a little bit with fine tuning. Some are actually building out their own models themselves. It's still early. I think we're still seeing an evolution of this. So you need to make sure that your generative AI strategy is aligned again with those business values and be very specific on just the use cases because you're not going to know everything yet about the generative AI space. And so because you're going to have to show some measurable value to your board to continue to get that investment, make sure that you're delivering those use cases that can provide some level of value that you can give, can get a return on the investment and continue to experiment, but be really clear with your executives that it's experimentation, right? Because I think lots of CEOs are still thinking that Gen AI will solve a lot of their problems and a lot of their issues. So it's sort of taking them on the journey as well. The other question I get asked often is how do we prioritize which processes to leverage generative AI on? And really it comes down to a balancing or a weighing of innovation versus risk, right? So how fast does the organization want to innovate and how much risk are you willing to take? I'm not giving any of you permission to go use PII data on generative AI use cases, just so you have me recorded saying that. I don't think that's the right thing, but you need to look inside the organization and say, where are we willing to innovate a little faster and leverage sort of this capability or this data assets where we may not have the entire solution or the entire story or the entire use case, but we want to be agile and we want to experiment and test. And so definitely have clarity with your leadership as you're getting ready to execute against those use cases. As you've built up sponsorship across the business, I'm sure every business is clamoring for some level of generative AI use case. So set the right expectations with them that you're really trying to balance that, how you're going to help them innovate, leveraging the data services that you're providing and the generative AI solutions, and how much risk are they willing to take in order to participate in that experimentation. The other thing to think about is platform considerations. We've seen lots of announcements, but maybe let me just give you a few rules of thumb. I think the first one is simplify. Lots of our organizations have become very complex. We have lots of products and services, and not all of them allow us to leverage generative AI quickly or as effectively or efficiently. So we're starting to see some of the pain around that. The other thing I would really call out is organizations tend to think about things in just one technology or one capability, but for many, multi-cloud is really a reality, whether it's through mergers and acquisitions, whether it's through a divestiture, whether it's because your marketing group won't get off GCP and your R&D won't get off AWS and you can't get them onto a single cloud, which is all fine. But think about the complexity that introduces when you're rolling out things like your data platform to support the Gen AI use cases. All of those things introduce complexity to your environment. So where you can simplify and where you can get them aligned, you should really drive your strategy to achieve that goal. The other thing is to think about consolidation. I know that there's been a lot of focus around just migrating from on-prem to the cloud, but a lot of organizations are revisiting where can we actually start to consolidate our data estate? Where can we actually archive data that we're not necessarily using anymore? Does anybody have that one database, usually an IBM or an Oracle database that sits in your office where it has the sign on it that says do not touch? Don't unplug, right? So start to think about those things. How do you simplify some of that? How do you really start to consolidate some of that? For most organizations, that will be the last box that you touch in this simplification process. But really think about, is that the data that you want to leverage for generative AI? Probably not, because it's your mission critical sort of data. And so it's going to be some of the last to come in there, but take that into account as you're looking at the consolidation. And the other thing, I know you've heard this multiple times, but I think Databricks really has this perspective of open ecosystems. So the acquisition of Mosaic ML, a lot of the announcements you saw today. From my perspective, for most organizations, we really have the perspective of it's your data. We want you to be your model so that it's your intellectual property. When ChatGPT first came out, my grandmother called me and said, how do I use this thing? Like, I'm really trying to figure it out. And what I realized at that moment was my grandmother had the same competitive advantage as Databricks, right? Because we both could use ChatGPT at any time. What she didn't have, though, is the data inside of Databricks. And so really, taking care to think about your data strategy is executing a platform that allows you to be open and interchangeable, because as we talked about earlier, the pace of this innovation is faster than we've ever seen before. And so to lock yourself into a single model, a single ecosystem, will put you at a disadvantage as you continue to roll out your strategy. And your AI and data strategy takes a while to roll out, right? So you're not going to be able to complete it. It will not. Actually, when I left Microsoft after 15 years of working on it, I was still working on it, right? It just takes forever because the tech changes, the people change, the problems change, the processes change. So what the hope is that if you build an open ecosystem and an open platform, your organization continues to evolve as the technology evolves. That's why you should use the Data Intelligent platform to be able to help you solve some of that. So hopefully you got an idea earlier today on all of the amazing capabilities that we're rolling into Unity, that we're rolling out through the Data Intelligence platform, including, oh my gosh, I just realized this has some old names on it from sorry, some of the new names just came out this week, so I apologize. But the essence is there. Databricks is here to help you make sure that you have an open ecosystem to derive your generative AI capabilities through the platform. And hopefully you learned a few things about how do you bring people and process along on that journey. All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.